Like Dustin shared, we are kicking off a brand new series on relationships. And I think that this may just be one of the most important series that we cover this year because the reality is men and women are different. I don't know if you knew that, but men and women are different, which can often make relationships really tricky to navigate. And so what ends up happening in the relationships as they get difficult, as they get challenging, we begin to take unrealistic expectations into our relationships, and it can be difficult to navigate. It can be difficult to understand and figure out how to have a healthy relationship. And I've done a lot of weddings where I've performed a lot of weddings for people. Not that I've been married a lot of times, just to make that clear. But there was one year, not too long ago, I did 10 weddings in 1 year for young couples getting married. I've done a lot of premarital counseling for those getting ready for marriage. I've done, unfortunately, some counseling for those considering ending their marriage. I've gone to counseling for my own marriage. And one thing that I have found to be true over and over is that you will never drift into a healthy relationship or marriage. You don't just drift into a relationship that's healthy. It takes work. It takes intentionality. It takes time and effort. It takes choosing specific attitudes, habits, and actions. And it's why when we get married, we start our marriage with something we call a vow. And a vow is simply the promise or declaration that we make. It's not just meant to be some romantic, fun niceties that we say at an altar in front of a pastor and our family and friends. But the vow, well, here's how the vows go when I do a wedding. I ask couples to repeat after me and say these. It goes like this: I promise before God and our family and friends to be your loving and faithful husband or wife, in wealth and in poverty, in sickness and in health, in good times and bad times, forsaking all others for as long as we both shall live. Anybody ever hear anything close or resembling that? Watch a movie, maybe you saw it there, or you just don't like to participate and raise your hand. That's okay too. I think we've all heard kind of vows like this, these commitments. But here's the thing. A promise like that takes a whole lot of work and effort to keep it. And as I was preparing and getting ready this week, that really struck me. Because I'll tell you what, on my wedding day, as much as I meant it, I had no idea what it meant to make that promise. Right? It's easy to say the words, but when I get faced with the struggle, when I realize, oh, she's a lot different than me, she thinks different, acts different, sleeps different than me, right? Like, conflict arises. And vows are a hard thing, not necessarily hard to make, but a whole lot harder to follow through on, which is why Ecclesiastes in the Bible, it talks about this, and it speaks to the importance and the significance of the vows or promises that we make. Here's what it says. Ecclesiastes 5, starting in chapter 5, verse 2, it says this. It says, be not rash with your mouth. Which means don't be quick with your words. Don't just speak really quick and say things that you may not actually mean. Let not your heart be hasty to utter words before God. For God is in heaven and you're on earth, so let your words be few. For a dream comes with much busyness. What does that mean? Well, when we have a lot going on in our lives and lives are busy, our minds just keep going, right? And we dream about the things that are going on. Just like dreams come with a lot of busyness, a fool's voice comes with a lot of words. So when you vow a vow to God, do not delay in paying it, for he has no pleasure in fools. He has no pleasure in those who talk a lot but don't actually follow through with their promises. When you vow a vow, don't delay in paying it. Pay what you vow, for it's better that you should not vow than that you would vow and not pay. He's saying it's better that don't even make the promise. It's better that you wouldn't even make the promise than that you would promise it, say a bunch of things that you don't actually mean or won't follow through on. And today we're going to begin where it all began, with the vow of priority. And each week we're going to take a look at a different promise and how to solidify the relationships that we are seeking or the relationships that we're in. How do we make sure to have a healthy marriage? And we're going to start with the vow or this promise of our priorities. See, when we're in a relationship, there are a lot of different things that can grab for our attention that we make our priority. It could be kids, it could be finance, it could be each other. But before we can have a healthy relationship with another person, before that starts, there has to be a priority in our relationship with God. See, it doesn't matter if you're married or dating, engaged or courting, if you're just swiping or if you're stalking. It doesn't matter if you're trying to dig yourself out of the friend zone. The promise of priority, what we're going to discover is that it shapes everything about the relationships that we have. And if you want a marriage that will last a lifetime, it takes intentional effort in the right priorities. See, when our priorities aren't aligned correctly, when our priorities are wrong, everything else in the realm of our relationships gets twisted. We start to think that we have to be what others expect us or need us to be. And so then we carry in our dysfunction and our insecurities, our hopes and our dreams and expectations into every relationship of life. It's why so many people will think, if I just find the right person, right? I just got to find that right person. When I find Prince Charming, ladies, he doesn't exist. That's good. That's good. If I can just find the right person, then I'll be happy. Right? If I just find the right person, then I'll be loved. If I can get that right person, I'll be accepted. They'll even make me a better person. And like so many in my relationships in the early years of growing up, my priority was that my girlfriend, my relationship would help define who I was. And so I carried all these expectations into a relationship, trying to get this status. Because when you're in middle school and high school, the status of girlfriend, like that meant you were cared for and loved. And so I would take these expectations and put unfair and impossible standards on whoever I was dating. Expectations that they were never meant to carry, that they were never meant to hold. But here's the thing, when I pursue the right priority, when my priorities shift and my identity can be built on something that was meant to carry it, and my life can begin to change and be shaped differently. This is what happened for me in high school. See, in high school, I began to shift my priorities and my pursuits from my relationship with girls and my relationship status to my relationship with Jesus. And as corny as it may sound, when Jesus became real to me as a freshman in high school, I no longer started looking for my priority and my identity to be found in girls, but it shifted to God. Making my identity in who I was become a whole lot clearer for the very first time in my life. And I began to realize and learn this priority, that the promise of my priorities will solidify the foundation of my identity. That what I give my life to in priority will shape what I become and the identity that I hold on to. And we see this same thing play out in the life of David. David, most famous for the battle with Goliath. That David, that's who we're going to talk about today, because his life is an example of a man whose identity was solidified by his promise and his vow and commitment to the Lord. His unwavering commitment to God. And as we do a flyover of David's life, and today's going to be a lot different than I will normally preach. Typically, we'll take one passage and we'll kind of walk through it, pull out some applications, apply it to our life, and go. And today, because I want to hit singles, dating, married, and maybe any other relationship status that might exist within there, we're going to take a snapshot look at David's life, okay? And so we're going to highlight several key passages that point to specific seasons in David's life where his identity was being formed because of the priorities that he pursued. And so we find three principles in David's life that lead to the formation of his identity, and these same principles can be applied to our life today. And I want to be clear, when we read in God's word, when we look at Scripture, there was always one specific meaning and purpose in the context in that day for that situation. It meant something specific to the context. But the same principles and lessons that we learn from those stories and throughout Scripture can be applied in multiple different ways in our own lives today. And that's what we're going to take a look at. That's what we're going to see. And so if you have a Bible, you can turn to 1 Samuel. We're going to be taking a look at 1 and 2 Samuel today. If you don't have a Bible, you can take your camera app on your phone, scan one of those QR codes, and click the Bible. It'll take you to 1 Samuel, and you can be able to follow along with us. As you're turning there, though, the context of what we're looking at is really important. See, 1 and 2 Samuel, these two books of the Bible, it's page 238 if you have the exact same Bible that I have. Not that that's helpful, just thought maybe. 1 and 2 Samuel, these two books cover a unique time in Israel's history. A unique transitional period when they're transitioning from a group of people in tribes to establishing a monarch. See, for the Israelite people, God wasn't enough anymore. They didn't see God as their king. They wanted a physical, real king, a human representative of the king, just like all the other nations around them had. And so they beg and plead with God. And finally, in chapter 10 of 1 Samuel, God anoints Saul to be the first king of Israel. Saul starts off okay, but as he leads, he stops focusing on his identity as a king appointed by God, and he starts leaning into his status as king. And so he stops following God. He stops leading the kingdom with God in mind, and so God begins to prepare the next king. This is where David enters the picture. But David's journey to this kingship is different. Throughout his journey, throughout this pursuit to become king, there are some really key similarities that we can learn from David's life as we pursue different statuses that we try to attain today. Specifically, maybe relating to our relationship status. What we see in David's life is that his identity was not dependent on his status, and that when we prioritize a solid foundation on Christ, he shapes our identity. See, in chapter 16, the prophet Samuel, who had anointed Saul as king, is now sent by God to go anoint someone new as king. And he doesn't know who it is yet, but God says, I'm going to send you to Jesse's house, the Bethlehemite. And you're going to go there, and when you get there, I'm going to show you which of his sons is going to be the next king. And so Samuel goes, and he lays out all the sons in front of him, kind of like a Bachelor episode, where one by one the sons come forward, and are they going to be accepted? Are they going to be approved? And Saul gets through all of them, or Samuel gets through all of them, and he's like, no, Jesse, none of these. Do you have any more kids? Do you have one locked in the basement somewhere? Like, what's going on? Like, it's none of these. Do you have another son? And Jesse's like, well, yeah, but he's the shepherd. He's the youngest, David. And Samuel says, go get him. And he demands that David be brought. And so David comes on the scene now. And here's what it says, 1 Samuel 16, 12 through 13. You can follow along. It says, they sent and brought David in. Now, David, it describes David to us. It says he was ruddy, which we don't really use that term to describe people today. You can imagine as a shepherd, his skin is kissed by the sun. He's well tanned. He's a good-looking kid. It says that his eyes were beautiful and he was handsome, kind of this ruggedly handsome boy. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. And Samuel took the oil and poured it over David's head, anointing him in the midst of his brothers. Now, to be anointed simply means that David in this moment is being chosen by God with a purpose. That David is being chosen by God with a purpose in the midst of his brothers, in the midst of his father, being told that he's going to be the next king. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David, and from that day forward. And then Samuel, he rose up and he went to Ramah. And as David is being confirmed in his identity, chosen by God for a specific purpose, in that very same moment, he is also receiving the promise of a future status to be king. See, David's current status is that of a shepherd, but that wasn't going to determine or define his identity. And it's important for us to see this and understand that David's status wasn't secure, but David's identity was. And as at the peak of this moment, Samuel anoints him, you're going to be the next king. And then Samuel leaves, and David goes back to shepherding sheep. Because his status hadn't been secured, but his identity was. See, I think a lot of times we confuse our identity, what God has created for us for and called us to, with the status that we're trying to, and our desire that we're trying to achieve in a relationship. And if you're here in the room today and you're single, I don't care if you're in middle school, high school, if you're an adult, or if you're single, what do you do when the status doesn't match what you feel like God has called you to do? What do you do when the status of wanting to be married, of wanting a relationship isn't a reality? You want someone, you want to fall in love, you want to get married, you want to have kids, but you're single, you're swiping, you're still alone. What do you do? Well, here's what David did. He starts with what God said, not with what he could see. See, he starts with what God says, not what he can see. We can often get so focused on our desire for status, for a relationship, that we forget the identity that God has given us. We want the relationship so much that we disregard the plans and purposes that God has for me right now. See, David was a shepherd, and he couldn't quite see the king thing yet. But in the wait, he was learning how to care for, how to defend, how to protect and lead some sheep. And this is something that shepherds and kings have in common. Just as a shepherd would lead and care and take care of the sheep, the king would be called to care and take care of and protect his people. And if you're single, I want you to write this down. Don't sell your singleness. Don't think that if I can just get past this season, this moment in my life of singleness and get on to the next stage of pursuing the status, don't sell your singleness, because what God wants to use in your preparation, he will use in your destination. And what David was going through was learning some things that were going to prepare him for what God was leading him to. And what you are going through today, what you are going through right now, is preparing you for what God has for you in the future. All right, so what if I'm not single? What if I'm dating? What if I'm in a relationship? What if I'm engaged? What if I'm in pursuit of the marriage status? Well, shortly after David is anointed to be the next king, Saul says that he needs a musician to come play for him. Saul was going crazy in his mind. He was uber depressed. He was struggling a ton. And so what we begin to see at the end of chapter 16 and into 17 is Saul is really struggling, and so he says, I need a musician, and David becomes that musician that comes to the king's courts and starts playing music to calm Saul down. And it works. But in that moment, David is now brought into proximity of the status. He's in the kingdom. He's in the same proximity as the current king. He's playing music, looking at Saul sitting on his throne and thinking, that's my throne. He can see it. He knows it's coming, but it's not here yet. And it would be 15 years from when David was anointed to when he would be crowned. That's a lot of waiting. It's a lot of preparation. And I think sometimes when we're dating, that's how we can feel. I can see my future with this person. I want it. We're in love, but we're not married yet. And David is in pursuit of the king's status. He's being prepared by God, but there are some things that come up against David to try to derail and distract him from what God is doing. One of those is this most famous story of David. It's found in chapter 17. Here's kind of the next story that we're looking at, where David comes against this giant Goliath. But here's how it happens. Israel, being led by King Saul, come to war against the Philistines who had gathered and come up against him. And when they come to the battlefield, this behemoth of a human comes walking out onto the field, and he tells everyone how this war is going to happen. He says, you pick one person, whoever you want, they're going to face me. It's going to be a one-on-one battle, winner takes all. And he does this for 40 days. Now, 1 Samuel 17 tells us a little bit about this giant. He was almost 10 feet tall. I mean, I can't even get on my tippy toes and get there. I'm 6 feet, so this is about 9. He's he's up there, okay? He's massive. But not only is he tall, he's not like the Jolly Green Giant. He also has 125 pounds of armor on him. That's a small high schooler, folks. As his armor, this massive man, and all of Israel is terrified. No one will go, and for 40 days. Well, David is spending some of his time in the kingdom with Saul, playing music, and then on the weekends, going back to Jesse's to help take care of the sheep. And one day, his dad sends him with a sacked lunch. Hey, David, go deliver this to your brothers who are on the front lines of this battle, right? They're just sitting in their camp. No one wants to fight the giant. And so David becomes the Uber Eats delivery guy for the day, bringing lunch to his brothers. And while he's there, Goliath comes out and shouts out this challenge. And look at what this silly high schooler says. 1 Samuel 17, verse 26. He says this. David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Do you see just the youthfulness in this young boy who comes and he's looking at all these military, older guys, and he's like, hey, what's going on? Who's going to step up? Who is this guy threatening? Not Saul's army, not the Israeli army, the army of the living God. See, to David, this wasn't just some war challenge. This was a challenge on their identity as God's people. Because when you know whose you are, you know who you are. And David decided enough was enough. No one was going to attack the foundation of his identity. And so he says, I will meet the challenge. And now everyone's freaking out. His brother's like, shut up, you don't know what you're talking about. Be quiet, get out of here, go back to dad. And he's like, no, I'm doing this. Well, fine, if you're going to do it, then let's at least try to protect you. And they take him to Saul, the king, and they start putting on his armor. This is 1 Samuel 17, 39 and 40. They start putting all this armor, this man-sized armor on this little shepherd boy. And he tries to move around, and he can't. And this is what he says. David said to Saul, I can't go with these, for I have not tested them. So he put them off. And instead he grabbed the weapons of a shepherd, a handful of rocks, a stick, and a slingshot. And he goes out to fight the giant. See, to David, it didn't matter the expectations or pressure that everyone around him put on him. He couldn't wear the royal army. Why? Or the royal armor. Why? Because he wasn't royalty yet. That wasn't his role. That wasn't his position. He was a shepherd. He couldn't be something that he wasn't. He had to be who he was and do what he knew how to do. And here's what he knew how to do. He knew how to trust God. And he knew how to fight off anything that came to attack what he was called to defend. And so he goes against the giant. He defeats the giant. He cuts off his head. He wins the victory. David's motivation in this moment was not to show off. It wasn't to be some great warrior. It wasn't to speed up his path to the king position. He took down Goliath to end something. And turn to your neighbor, say end. Hold on to that for a second. See, he took down Goliath to end the assault on the identity that his faith was founded on. And David trusted and believed that God would do what he had said he would do. But that wasn't the only obstacle David faced. See, after David defeats the giant, Saul, the current king, starts getting really frustrated. He's really insecure. He doesn't like all the attention this young David is getting. He feels like his reign is being threatened. And so he does what any sane and trusted leader would do. He tries to kill David, and he tries to do it a lot. And the first time we see this happen, so David runs for his life, and Saul comes hunting after him. And in this first encounter, 1 Samuel 24, we see David being pursued by Saul and 3,000 men. Overcompensating much, Saul? Like, really, 3,000 men? It says that David and his men are hiding in the back of this cave in this one instance, 1 Samuel 24. And I love the Bible because it gives us just enough information, and it's fairly comical when it does. David and his men are hiding. Saul doesn't know where they are. He's searching. But then it says that Saul had to relieve himself. Saul had to go to the bathroom. He had to take a potty break. And so he goes to the nearest cave, just so happened to be the same cave David's hiding in. And based on what happens, I think that Saul is going number 2. Not to get too, and it doesn't tell us, but here's what happens. Saul goes to relieve himself, and David sneaks up behind him and cuts off his robe. Like, cuts a piece of it off. I think you have to be a little more occupied, like David was. So Saul finishes, he goes to get back with his men, and David comes out of the cave. And David says, Saul, why do you listen to everyone saying that I want to kill you? Why are you hunting my life? Verse 10, 1 Samuel 24, verse 10. He says, why are you believing? Why are you listening to everyone trying to take that I'm trying to harm you? And he says in verse 10, behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you into my hand in this cave. Some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said I would not lift my hand against my Lord, the king, for he is the Lord God's anointed. See my father. Look at the just tenderness and the respect that David is giving the man who's trying to kill him. My father. This is like family to David. See the corner of your robe in my hand? For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and I did not cut off your head, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it. Right here, David is in the perfect opportunity to achieve the status that he was promised, to achieve the status that he was chosen for. Kill the king and become the king. So why doesn't he just take it? Why not just take it? Help yourself arrive at the status. Because on the journey to the status, there will be things that you have to end, and there will be things that you have to endure. David needed to end Goliath, but he had to endure Saul. The difference, Goliath had come in opposition against God and against David's identity. Saul was placed in a position by God only to delay the status. And even though David was anointed, he knew that the one who had anointed him would also have to be the one to appoint him. He couldn't take it. He had to trust God in the waiting. He had to allow his priority to be solidified in God first. That shaped his identity and everything else, and his relationship and his status, and everything would come after that. And if you're here today and you're dating or you're engaged, if you're on the journey to the status of marriage, then listen, the vow and the promise of priority, when we know who we are because of the foundation that has formed our identity, then it's got to shape the response of our pursuits. You can write this down if you're dating, if you're engaged. In pursuit of the status, you will have challenges that you will have to end and challenges that you will have to endure. So how can we tell the difference? How do I know what to end? How do I know what to endure? It starts with standing solid in your identity with Christ first. And when he is the center of my focus, the center of my attention, then everything else in my life becomes clear. What I end, what I endure. This promise of priority, the promise that to God that my priority is him first, allows me to defend my dating. If you're single, you can write that down. If you want to defend your dating, then put Christ first. Make the vow to him first as the source of your life. Don't let circumstances define your identity. Don't let compromise impact your call. Here's what that looks like for so many in relationships pursuing the status of marriage. Well, we just live together. It's just cheaper, right? It's more convenient with our work schedules, or I know that they're not following Jesus. I know they're not a Christian, but honestly, like we've just been dating so long, we're in love. I'm praying that God will change their heart, and it should work out. Or we've been together so long, I may as well say yes. It just seems like the next right thing to do. And on go the excuses and go the compromises that we make when there are some things that God has called us to end and then other things that he's called us to endure. See, like David did with the giant, anything that would come against God's call to your identity and value must be ended. And anything that, like David did with Saul, anything that challenges you to compromise or to do things your way instead of God's way, those things must be endured. Don't compromise your purity. Don't compromise your beliefs. Don't compromise your standing and your identity. Endure the things that need to be endured to solidify the destination, and end the things that threaten to compromise your calling. So what about when we have arrived at the status? What about when I'm married? What does the vow or the promise of priority look like when we're married? Well, to see that, we look at David when he had arrived at the status, when he becomes king. And he starts off really well as king, and he starts off balancing his identity and his status, allowing his identity to shape his status and navigate the status as king. But what we're about to see is what happens when David loses track, and he encounters a moment where he settles for the status. This is 2 Samuel chapter 11. You can write that down, follow along. 2 Samuel chapter 11 says it like this. In the springtime of the year, the time when kings went out to battle, David sent Joab and his servant with him and all of Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and they besieged Rabbah. But look at this, David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon. It happened. The downfall, the catastrophe that was inevitable. It so happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and he went walking on the rooftop of the king's house, looking at the beautiful sunset. And he sees from the rooftop a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And so David sent and inquired about the woman, and he said, and someone said, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife?" Hey, David, it's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he laid with her. And now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I'm pregnant." I love how the Bible gives us the information we need without getting too graphic about it all. We know exactly what's happening here. And it all starts with David remained in Jerusalem. It was wartime, the time when kings would go to battle. And instead, David decides to live out his calling as king from a distance. Instead, he sends out his military forces and they go to war, but he remains home. This is a big deal because I think a lot of us would look at this story and think, oh, David messed up when he looked at Bathsheba. Or he messed up and it all started going wrong when he inquired and asked about her. Or when he invited her over or when they laid together. Like, no, none of that helped. But where it went wrong is when David got comfortable in his position as king, in his status, and he stopped living out in his identity as a shepherd to the people. David settles for the status. See, all that God had prepared him for this destination, all the things that he had ended and endured, it all led to this moment, but in this moment he settles for something. He becomes complacent. And here's how it happens for us. We settle for the destination of marriage, the destination of this status of being married, which then becomes a substitute for my identity. We think that marriage is this status that we arrive at. And so we think that this status of being a husband, this status of being a wife, it's great until it stops fulfilling my expectations. It's great until someone stops keeping their end of the vow. And through the really, really hard seasons, when we're leaning on our spouse and making them our source of identity, and they fail to live up to what I've expected him or her to be, I begin to realize that my expectations have been in the wrong place. See, the expectations I put on them, they were never meant to carry. And unless we course correct and get back to the foundation of our identity, we will just keep recreating new identities, new statuses to form our identity. My marriage isn't fulfilling. They're not meeting my expectations. So I need a new status. I need to pursue something more at work and take on more responsibilities to define me, to bring value to me. Or you know what? I know what it is. Marriage isn't enough, so I need kids. I need the status of being a parent. That'll solve everything. And then we have kids and we put our expectations on our kids that they were never meant to carry. And when they let us down, we think it speaks badly on our identity because we've made our status our identity. And God's saying, no. You're not what you do. You're not the status you have. You are who I say you are. The truth is, it's not your marriage that's broken. It may not be your relationship that's broken. It may not be your parenting that's broken. What's broken are the expectations you have on those things that it was never meant to be able to carry. And so it's no wonder why when life gets hard, we get so confused. It's the promise of priority. What I make my priority, the commitment, the vow that I make, that course corrects my heart to point towards the only one capable of fulfilling, reshaping, and exceeding our expectations. Here's the difference. I, Kip, am not a husband, a dad, who's a pastor and resides in Illinois. I'm a child of God, unreasonably forgiven, relentlessly loved, that God has chosen to use for different areas and seasons in my life. If you're here today and you're single, you are not a single. You're a child of the Father being prepared and building on a foundation for that which God is calling you to. If you're dating, you're not dating. You're a child of the Father taking steps to grow in courage towards that which God is calling and preparing you for. And you're not married. You're a child of the Father in a holy union that was designed to passionately pursue the God who has called you. Singles, don't sell your singleness. What God uses in your preparation, He wants to use in your destination. If you're dating, defend it. Defend it by ending the things that are challenging and enduring the things that are challenging, that are trying to come against and redefine your identity. And if you're married, don't settle for the status. Your status was never meant to be a substitute for your identity. And as we wrap up and close our time this morning, the question becomes, so what do I do with that? Here's a 30,000-foot view of David's life, and here's what he did here, and here's what he did here, and here's what he did here, and here's how it might connect to the relational status that you're currently in, but now what? If you're single, I want you to begin to consider, I want us all to begin to consider and remind ourselves, where are you working? What are you learning? What season of life does God have you in right now? What things is He trying to teach you? And on your phone app or on a piece of paper, write down how God is preparing you now for what He will call you to later. What is He teaching you now to prepare you for then? You don't need to manufacture. You don't need to cut corners or manipulate your desired outcome. Prioritize God as your identity and let Him shape your life's priorities. If you're dating, if you're engaged, write down the things that are in front of you, the things trying to derail your dating, things trying to derail your destination. Commit to enduring the things that defy the God who defines us. Excuse me. I misspoke that. Commit to ending the things that defy the God who defines us. And commit to enduring the things that help lead to who we were created to be. And if you're married, write down the areas where you've settled or become complacent. Out of this whole message, because I'm married, and because God does this thing of revealing my own failures and my own problems in my life, preparing through this, God just made it really clear some areas that I've just settled in the status of being married and thinking that's enough. And I've stopped investing. I've stopped putting in the time and the effort to let my identity in Christ shape and define how I respond to the status that I have in my marriage as a husband. What are the areas that you've broken the vows or promises that you once made? How have you allowed the position or status of being married to hijack your expectations and priorities? See, if you're married, commit to identifying your misplaced expectations. The expectations you've put on your spouse that they were never meant to carry, and take the necessary steps to follow the example of Christ, who calls us to serve and love, to protect and care for our spouse, like a shepherd would care for the sheep. How will you take care of the vow that you made? We all must begin to refocus our identity, to identify the things that we have prioritized, to understand that it's not our culture that tells us who we are. It's not my spouse. It's not others and their expectations of me. My identity starts with my priority of Christ first, Christ most. Then your identity is able to impact and influence your relationships in a healthy way. See, if you're like me, the desire for a healthy marriage is there. What is lacking so often is a plan, an awareness to prioritize the vows that I've made to the Lord and the vows that I've made to my wife. And when I don't have the plan, when I don't recognize what's happening, when I don't recognize or see what I've done, it's easy to settle and come up with excuses why I haven't been doing it. And so what steps will you take today?